Welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'm your host, Various Artists, and please join me as I time travel back and revisit almost every live show I've ever seen from 1975 to the present. That feeling, that something, that magic I'd hoped to find at that Elvis Costello show that had been so present with the Roxy Music gig in 1975. Well, I found it here. This was a killer show. The second 5-star concert of my life. The Jam were burning with passion, and with sharp rapidity, they delivered one of the tightest sets I've ever seen. I think Paul Weller hit one bum note the whole night, and boy, did he look pissed when he did it. He, Bruce Foxton, and Rick Buckler seemed to be energy incarnate, never flagging for a moment. This night also had 2 new concert-going firsts for me. Hey everyone, your host, Various Artists here at the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. Welcome back and thanks for listening. This time it's episode 12, concert number 4. This is the modern world. The Jam with the Dwight Twilley Band, Twilley Band, Rex Danforth Theatre, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Tuesday, April 10th, 1979. Just like to remind everyone out there to like, follow, and subscribe on Facebook, Instagram, and we've got our YouTube channel, which also has our podcasts as well as some older videos. We're planning on putting up some videos we hadn't put up before, as well as some vintage stuff. I'm now getting off some old videotapes, so more is going to be coming in that way. Also, there's the MyLifeInConcert.com website with all the original podcasts, and Buzzsprout houses our podcasts as well as they're embedded on the website and can be found on fine podcasters everywhere. We also have Spotify playlists as companion pieces to some of the episodes. With each playlist, in the title it starts with MLIC, followed by a prompt, so that way you can identify them. Unfortunately, my pen name, Various Artists, is what this Spotify account is set up under, which probably wasn't the best name, but there you go. And there is a Jam playlist up for this episode. Some of my favorite outtakes, B-sides, deep cuts, rarities, live tracks, etc. So go check that out. I'd also like to mention that my original blog entry has been included in this new book, The Jam, The Day I Was There. Now, there's a series of these The Day I Was There books put together by Neil Kossar and Richard Houghton. And what it does is act as a compilation of entries of things people have written, magazine articles, live reviews, all sorts of things that sort of paint a day-by-day picture from the fan base, people around the band, that sort of thing. So my piece was included in this book, although I'm less than happy about one thing. It does appear on page 80 and 81. However, it's listed as being I Was There, Glenn Nicholson. I do not know who Glenn Nicholson is, and no, that is not Various Artists' real name. So I don't know who that is. My piece is there from the blog, but the name is wrong. I mean, how difficult is Various Artists anyway? Pick up the book. I'm in there. Lots of others, lots of other information, and Rick Buckler wrote the introduction. Okay, on with the show. So I'll pick up where I left off last time. Now, in episode 8, it was Elvis Costello in the fall of '78 at Alumni Hall in London, Ontario, and it's the first show I've seen of any of the artists to come out of the punk new wave movement that I've been following for years now and just finally getting to hear. And it was my first time seeing a concert in a hall rather than a big shed. So in the last 2 episodes from 1978, Bob Seger and Elvis Costello, I talked about the shift in my tastes away from some of the more mid-70s mainstream rock, which I never really went back to. Some I did, some I didn't. And became completely engulfed by all the new music, punk and new wave, which I'd been reading about and then listening to. And somewhere in the summer of 1978, the old wave completely lost out for a few years. So between Costello in November of '78 and this concert by the Jam in April of '79, pretty much my three key listening groups, and pretty much it was punk, new wave, and reggae, as well as another one that was added, which we'll be talking about shortly. As well as this is the time I finally get to hear the Velvet Underground. I knew Lou Reed, and I'd been wanting to hear the Velvets, but their records were actually very hard to get in the 70s, and finally I knew some people who were lending me their records, and that started something that's just gone on until this day. My three favorite acts of all time, if I had to come down to three, it's probably easier to talk about 100 and more representative, but it would probably be the Beatles, the Velvet Underground, and David Bowie. And so this point, probably more than ever, is a complete saturation in these genres, as well as a brand new one that has come around that will soon completely overtake my listening, and that's the arrival of post-punk, which for me, I first really heard with Susie and the Banshees' debut, The Scream. I knew the Hong Kong Garden single, which is one of my favorite singles of the 70s, which is pretty accessible and poppy. But hearing that Scream album by Susie and the Banshees right at the start of 79, that's one of those listening experiences I remember. It's like hearing the Ramones. There's a before and there's an after, because you're literally hearing something that you've never heard before. And of course, they had been part of the original punk bands, and it took a few years to finally have this debut album happen. And it's interesting when you think of the first wave of bands, a lot of the bands that were part of that first scene in 76, the bands who sort of didn't get to record till later, Susie and also the Slits a year later, for me came out with some of the most interesting albums, because by that point they had completely transitioned into a new sound and sounds that were completely of their own. And so that whole post-punk thing was launched. Strange, moody, dark, angular, sinister, experimental music, but with that sort of scrappy punk DIY ethic. So I went back and made a list of what was I listening to, and I've alluded to this in some other episodes. And I want to do this, kind of come up with a playlist of the time of what I was listening to and what I was hearing, because especially if you're really into music, what you're listening to and the music you're hearing really provides a sense of place and time. I know it does for me, but I think it's a case for a lot of people. And this was one of those times where it just this explosion of bands and ideas and sounds and incredible records. It's sad to think of now. Although right now, admittedly, there's a lot of good stuff coming out this year, but these days of just all this amazing music coming out at once, going in all these directions, and a lot of it not even really caring a whole lot about any kind of commerciality. Yeah, that's certainly gone. So this is my playlist. These are what comes to mind for me during, say, late winter of 79 through the spring. And, of course, I just mentioned Susie and the Banshees, The Scream. Also, the Demics, our local band, the first sort of punk rock record from the scene, the Talks GPP. The Clash's Give 'Em Enough Rope. The Buzzcocks, Love Bites. Yeah, that one. Also, Can't Stand the Rosillos. The Great Rock and Roll Swindle soundtrack, and That's Life, Sham 69. Maybe those two I don't play quite as much as some of the others. The last Pogo compilation of the last gig of all the punk bands at the Horseshoe in Toronto. Look Sharp, Joe Jackson, The Police's first album, Outlandis d'Amour. Generation X, Valley of the Dolls, the one Gen X album I like. Lou Reed's The Bells, and also, as I mentioned, a lot of finally getting to hear the VU. Graham Parker, Squeezing Out Sparks. Lena Lovitch, Stateless. Peter Tosh, Bush Doctor, the Cortinas, True Romances. That's kind of an obscure one that I always really like. And the third Deaf School album, which I think is their best, English Boys, Working Girls. And singles from that time, there was some great debuts. The Pretenders, Stop Your Sobbing. The Skids, Into the Valley. Oh, wow, when I first heard that. Toronto's Mods, who we'll be getting back to, put out Step Out Tonight, a great little first effort. I finally picked up Complete Control by The Clash, which I hadn't had. And, of course, Buzzcocks' new one, Everybody's Happy Nowadays. Susie had on a new single, Staircase. And, of course, a brand new single from that time by The Jam, Strange Town and The Butterfly Collector. By this point, in the spring of 79, actually by the fall of 78, The Jam had really become something special to me. And essentially, over the next 4 or so years until their demise, they became essentially one of my 2 or 3 favorite bands. So we're talking about an explosion of a lot of groups from this period that I loved, but particularly then the Jam, were very, very special to me, and I was a mega fan. Now, as I previously mentioned in my Bob Seger episode 7, but that was really more about me discovering punk rock and going to the UK than the Seger concert. The Jams in the City was the first punk rock album that I bought, and I did so on a trip to the UK in the summer of 1977. And this is a rehash for some of the people who've heard those episodes, but for those who haven't, I knew I wanted to bring back a punk rock LP. I'd been following that, and there was only kind of, and especially for one of the British bands, because none of them were available over here, very little. At that point, maybe that changed in the fall. But there were only so many albums available, and like Nevermind the Bollocks came out a couple of months after this. So, given the choices available that August, I selected In the City, based on the great press it had gotten. I'd been reading about it in the music press, and then when I got there, even though it had come out earlier, it was still being talked about. And also, there was probably a bit of a bridge thing there, is that they were clearly very influenced by a lot of the British groups from the 60s. Particularly, I mean, The Who and the Rolling Stones were in there, but it was more the Kinks and especially The Who. There was also a bridge sort of thing there for me in that a lot of the British 60s music was extremely familiar to me, even though I'm too young to have memories of the British invasion. By the late 60s, I have memories onwards, and by all accounts from everyone, I was obsessed by music right from the beginning. So I already had a big love of all that. And it's weird looking back now, because in the 70s, it was really all about what's the new thing, the new thing, the new thing. But I realize now I was also going back, probably because I only had limited pocket money, and buying a lot of albums from the 60s and that. So I was listening to a lot of stuff from that period, and I never kind of put that together. So even when punk was coming around, even though I was very much with my feet in the 70s, I still had my head back rediscovering things from that day. And of course, all of those records were around when I was growing up. So it's all part of my DNA. So I thought, okay, well, they're coming from some of these sources that I like, because especially since The Who and the Kinks had been such big, important groups for me, and still are, particularly the Kinks. I mean, I love The Who as well, but the Kinks just a little bit more so. And way down the line, there's going to be this amazing Ray Davies solo show. And the first album I ever bought with my own money, age 7, saving up my quarter allowance for 4 months, I purchased the Kinks' Arthur, or the Decline and Fall of the British Empire. So, yeah, bought that at 7. It is literally, in that album, every note of it is ingrained on my brain, I think, from just repeat playing as a child. And yeah, it's a bit of a different kid. That kind of drew me in. And of course, they used the whole mod iconography from the 60s in their image. They adopted that look. And in getting successful, they actually relaunched a mod revival in England in the late 70s. So I got the Jams album. I think I bought it up in Northern England. And we were staying with an aunt and uncle at the time who had a stereo system. And once everyone was out, I finally got to play my album, my first punk rock album. And it just hit me, the speed, the velocity, but also Weller's such a great writer. Even on his first album, the tunes were simple, but really catchy. It was tight. I loved it immediately. It's like, yes, this is the burst of excitement and energy I've been looking for. Also, because I was very aware of that explosion of music in the mid-60s, and I had, of course, been excited by all the music I'd been listening to, and the glam period had been so exciting. But I'd always kind of felt like I wish I could have experienced consciously that rush of energy-filled music from the 60s. And so I think for a lot of us in our generation, and also I knew people who were part of that generation who were into punk, that was also a different thing. It was a younger crowd in the UK than over here, because it was more of a bar crowd over here than there. And for us, this was our 60s British explosion in a harsher and darker and even more exciting form. So while I alternate played In the City and with David Bowie's Low, two totally different records, and also I picked up this great double Who compilation when I was there, The Story of the Who. Pretty much punk and new wave over the course of the year, gradually began to take over everything. And, once I was back, I bought the new albums by the Stranglers, Elvis Costello, the Vibrators, then Ramones, Boomtown Rats, blah, 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 on and on. Shortly after I'd left the UK, the Jam issued a quickie follow-up, This is the Modern World, a clever title with one foot in each of their key reference camps, alluding to both the It's Happening Now ethos of punk as well as the play on mod. Now, this is what I wrote on my blog in the original entry in 2010. Unfortunately, it was a typical case of the second record being a rush job and suffering for it. Not horrible, but not a record that moved forward on its predecessor's promise. I no longer agree with that. I've listened to it recently, and it's not true. It's not a big departure from the first one, but you have stuff like Life Through a Window and a few other tunes that are a little bit of in a different vein. So, again, I've switched my opinion on this one. But what's really incredible, too, is in 77, it was so normal for artists to release 2 albums a year, and also how good a lot of these albums were. I mean, think about it. There's years where I think 77 may be my favorite every year for albums, because literally almost every genre I liked was on fire. There were genres that were sunsetting for me, others that were picking up, but it just seemed like everyone was doing great work that year. And case in point, David Bowie, Low and Heroes, Iggy Pop, The Idiot, and Lust for Life. The Ramones, Rocket to Russia, which is my favorite Ramones album, and Ramones Leave Home. Stranglers, Radis Norvegicus, and No More Heroes, and of course 2 albums from the Jam. So when it came time to record a 3rd album from the Jam, Weller knew he had to step up his and the band's game and take things to a new level. He'd recorded 1 album. I'd love to hear some of these tapes that was completely aborted when it was finished. That was apparently in a more experimental vein. He said it sounded like the Stranglers at time, which I can't quite imagine. But then figured out what he wanted to do. The band went in, and then they cut All Mod Cons in 78 and then released it that fall. All Mod Cons delivered on all fronts. I truly believe it's their best album. Weller's songwriting went to a whole other level. There was more variance in the tempo and textures and topics of the song, and it was just a big leap forward in their sound and artistry, and it truly made them stars in Britain with 2 major hits off the album. Now, once again, the Who and Kinks influences were made explicit with this album. With the Kinks, most obviously, they did a cover of David Watts, the opening track from Something Else by the Kinks. Don't even get me started on how much I love that album. So they released that as a single earlier in the year as a double A side with A-Bomb and Wardour Street with Bruce Foxton singing David Watts because it wasn't in Weller's range. Later in the year, there's the Down in the Tube Station at Midnight single, which we'll get to in a moment. And on the back of that, there was a picture of the very young Keith Moon, who had recently died. And one of the B-sides is they did a cover of So Sad About Us from the second Who album. Now, my sister had returned from a UK trip in the fall of 78 and came back with both the All Mod Cons album and the Down in the Tube Station at Midnight single. With the latter, as mentioned, it branched out Weller's songwriting as it was an anti-racist story of a Pakistani man being assaulted by right-wing skinheads. And as I said, in terms of my own personal top 20, pretty much from this point till the end, they split the difference with The Clash as my favorite band in the world. And somewhere in about the middle of that, before both bands ended in 82, Joy Division joined in, and they were sort of they said it was a 3-way tie at that point. So they'd established themselves in the UK, and while they may have been a big deal in their native land, over here in North America, they hadn't made much of an inroad, particularly in the US. There's generally a thing where you have a lot of these bands that are huge in Britain, and they're more of a big cult band in Canada, and then they're more of a small cult band in the US. And the Jam were an example of this, as bit by bit their audience creeped up here, and they finally had a hit album with The Gift and Town Called Malice, the hit off their last album. A Motownish song with a very political theme. And you still hear it on oldies radio here all the time. Actually, I just heard it the other morning when my clock radio went off. Sort of it goes off, you're waking up in the day. It's, Town Called Malice. I better get up. So there's worse ways to start the day. Now, when I saw them in April of 79, they were touring All Mod Cons, which had been released a little later on, the start of the year on this side of the Atlantic. Now, over in the UK, they had a brand new single out, and it's one of, I think, their very best, Strange Town. And my brother had just come back from the UK and brought it with him, so I guess I started a custom in the family of people bringing back jam records from the UK. In England, I mean, they just had a string of big hits throughout their career, but I truly believe Strange Town, backed with the Butterfly Collector, is one of their very best. I've always sort of seen this song as Weller talking about his feeling of isolation, a bit of a misfit from the main London scene. And the things I like about the tune is the killer opening and ending, that sort of fab middle eight, and great harmonies, and his guitar playing at the end. Just, it's a perfect pop song. And then on the back, there's the Butterfly Collector. And of course, that title immediately evokes the classic British film from the 60s with Terence Stamp and Samantha Eggar. And again, it was a bit of a different tempo, a bit of a different feel. It had this sort of mysterious, slower feel. So again, they were exploring new ways of presenting their sound and writing and recording new kinds of songs. So my ramped up obsession with the jam meant that this show was going to be particularly special to me and very exciting for me. Not to mention that this was my first, actually there's two firsts with this point, my first concert outside of London, Ontario, and my first concert in Toronto. Here in London, Ontario, the city is equidistant between Detroit and Toronto. It's 2 hours each way, so geographically you know where I am. And as this podcast series continues, or as you can read on the blog, there will be many, many, many shows in Toronto of all shapes, sizes, and genres coming up through the decades. So this was the launch of something that has been consistent right up until the last couple of years. Now, Toronto had hosted many of the new punk groups from New York and England, and then as now, there are a lot of acts that tour who will play the Ontario capital, but nowhere else in the region. And also, Toronto had had an independently rooted and developed punk rock scene that happened concurrently with the other cities, with many of the Toronto contingent not really catching wind what was happening elsewhere until more 76. There wasn't as much of a media vehicle to sort of trigger an explosion or that kind of reaction as it had in the UK or within New York City. Now, we went down in a few cars. I went with my elder siblings, but other people came along as well. And I'm trying to think who. I think Kathy, later of the Zealots, was with us. And a few other, I can't remember. This is where I'm kind of blanking. We went down to a few cars. And there was a few of us, and it was this early spring day that was more like still a winter day. I remember there was snow on the ground. It was kind of cold. It was kind of yucky. So as sort of with this year, we had a winter that went long past the season. Now, the show took place at the Rex Danforth Theater, which was a converted old Odeon theater that had opened post-World War II. I found a picture of the old theater, and I've put it up on the mylifeinconcert.com website with this blog posting. And this was the first, yet another first, this was the first show I had attended at a small venue. Now, Alumni Hall, where I saw Elvis Costello, that was smaller. It was, I think it's about 2,300, and it was full for the show. This theater, I think, is more about 1,000, 900, 1,000. It was about that size. And this was my first time seeing a show in that size of a crowd, and I absolutely loved the intimacy and the immediacy of the Rex, just being a few feet away from somebody performing and really having that reciprocal energy where you're feeding off the musicians and they're feeding off your excitement. Now, I do like gigs of all different sizes. I know there's a lot of people where, I don't like big crowds. And I'm not really like that at all. I love the energy of big crowds and people coming together. So, of course, this whole COVID thing is very, very strange for me because I'm very oriented towards those sorts of things. But I love small gigs too. There's advantages of all different shapes and sizes. But I do love small, intimate gigs as well. And of course, the gigs are going to get smaller and smaller, and it gets smaller yet at the next show. And it was just everything about about the evening, being in Toronto, being in another city, being in this kind of dilapidated, rundown theater, seeing the band rather than more pristine or sort of these shed places in the suburbs. It had a real vibe and atmosphere to it. And also with the Costello show, there was just, a lot of curious people and people that were trying out the new music or had bought his albums. But this show really was the first show I saw that was with a quote-unquote punk rock audience, or people who were following the new bands and were genuinely into it. This was the real audience who was passionate about this kind of music. There was almost no awareness of the Jam outside of this small group of people who were listening over here. Now, in terms of how the crowd looked, that retro mod look was very prevalent in the crowd, and I participated in that, stylishly making the scene in my leather winklepickers and leather jacket, featuring a growing collection of badges announcing my preferred punk and new wave bands of the day. And for some London, Ontario folks of a certain vintage, I bought those at the old Siegel's warehouse downtown at York and Clarence, across from where Call the Office now is. And I remember at the time, sort of when that whole punk scene hit the city in the late 70s, all of the punks in the city were going to the Siegel's warehouse because it was this multi-floor warehouse that had been there for decades. And especially up on some of the top floors, it was all this old merchandise they hadn't sold from decades past. So everyone would go up there. And I think all those shoes got raided within about 2 years, everyone buying all this retro footwear. As for the leather jacket, I bought that at a Wednesday morning market in Cumbria in the north of UK in 77. Now, I could have sworn that Toronto band The Mods, who I mentioned earlier, opened this gig. This is what I originally wrote on the blog posting 10 years ago. In 2010, I wrote, opening act The Mods were from Toronto and had released a pretty good debut 45, Step Out Tonight. They aped the same mid-60s look and sound as the Jam. Well, actually, they plain old just aped the Jam. Oh, well, how about they were influenced by the Jam? Doing it not half badly in the process, even though the lead singer sounded much more like Bruce Springsteen than Paul Weller, and that kind of vocal style as well, but more with the sort of power pop British mod sound. They had a sizable local following and buzz in Toronto at the time, so they were well received. Now, that is how my memory remembered things 10 years ago. So I wrote this, put the blog entry up on opensalon.com, and sometime thereafter received the following from Mod's guitarist, Scott Marks. We never opened for the Jam for a number of reasons. One being that most of our bigger shows were booked by the two Garys, who had nothing to do with the Jam coming into Toronto. We played the New Music Hall twice, once opening for the Police in November of 1979, and our final gig opening for Squeeze there in 1980. Hey, I am truly flattered you remember our band and that you saw us play, but it definitely was not there. We never played the Rex. Beside the big shows above, we also opened for the Specials at the Palais Royal, my all-time favorite show as a mod. What I think happened was this. The Mods had played here in London at the Cedar Lounge, and I think my siblings had gone, I know my siblings had gone and met the band and talked to them, and that was kind of a month or two or a few months before this show. And now I remember, it's clear, we ran into the band and we were talking to the band. Well, I was probably just sort of standing there quietly, but we were talking to the band and interacted with them. So somehow in my mind, that got transposed to that they played and were well received. And as Scott Marks also says, yeah, I'm sure and believe you that we did chat with Greg because he was at the show, as was I. I believe we all attended, but as spectators, not participants. So it's interesting how and what you remember about things. And I'd like to plug an upcoming episode. It's actually the Boomtown Rats in March of 1980, my first show of the 80s. But even if you're not a fan of the Rats, who are coming back this year, which is cool, tune in for this one because it's one of those shows where I'm talking about the concert, but also a lot about something else, and particularly the nature of memory, which is something I've really thought about in the process of writing the original blog and now revisiting some of those things I wrote. It's interesting how you remember the past through what's going on in your present. And there's always aspects of unreliability with memory. Anyway, that's all coming up. And this is a clear example of me completely getting it wrong. So then it begs the question, Who the dickens did open this show? Well, that quandary for the ages was solved for me when another reader, Ricardo, wrote on the blog in 2017, Dwight Twiley opened for the Jam that night. Similar power pop roots, but not appreciated by the audience. I remember Jonathan Gross's review in the Toronto Sun, which said, Jam fans entertain themselves by throwing cigarette packages and more at him. And boom, it came back. Just reading that, I now see them on the stage, and actually I remember the cigarette packs, which is sad because when preparing this, I went back and listened to the band, and I actually really like them. I think it's the case where both bands are coming out of power pop, but the Jam were coming out of it in a very roots, street, authentic, working class way, relying on the wilder energy of the Beatles and those 60s groups and the Who. Whereas Dwight Twiley, it's coming from a more manicured American pop perspective. And I really like the tunes now. And a few years later, I was discovering Big Star and stuff like that. And it's all kind of in that vein. So I was not receptive that night, but I apologize, Dwight. Your show is probably good. It was one of those things, mismatched group and a mismatched show, and it just didn't go over. So thank you, reader Ricardo, wherever you may be. And thanks for the memory about the original Sun review. It's great to have those little tidbits to share. As for the main attraction, the Jam did not let the sense of occasion go unheeded as they raced onto the stage, launched into their opening number, and delivered a high-energy show that never lost its intensity. Now, there's this video that you can watch. It's easy to see. It's on YouTube, and it's from Tony Wilson's TV show, So It Goes, and it's the band at the Electric Circus in Manchester, I believe, in August 77, so this was right at the same time I was buying their debut album. And they come out and do In the City. And if you watch that performance, they come running out. It's just energy. They're just kicking it. It's raw, but it's super tight. That video is an example of what I remember from this gig, except for it was 2 years later, so they were a little more refined and there was more variance in what they were doing. But just the energy, the tightness, the enthusiasm, but also the crowd. The crowd was going nuts. Everyone was really into it. So you had this fully reciprocal show. And that intensity was there through the night, even when they were doing the Butterfly Collector. Actually, that's one of the songs that stays most in my memory, is them performing that track. They spat out taut renditions of In the City, which I was just mentioning, all around the world, and also Away from the Numbers. That's one I remember because it's my favorite track off the first album. And yes, they frequently did that leaping in the air thing. Also, on the back of the This Is the Modern World album, there's that picture of them on stage, leaping about, playing. That picture really captures the energy of their live show from this period. They came out and played this show like they meant it, and you knew they did. Now, the other big highlight for me is, I mentioned the Butterfly Collector. They did both sides of the new single. And it was also like, I know the new single and most of you don't. Nah. But again, Strange Town, such a great tune. And that's another one of the songs from the evening that does stay in my memory. So following the encores, the house lights came up on a drained and exhilarated audience. As with the Roxy Music Show, I knew I had seen something special. Now, this may sound corny, but it really did feel like this was the modern world I'd been waiting for, happening for us in this little venue while the shag-haired universe plundered on around us. That's one thing I remember, is coming out of this gig, everyone looked so great, the band was great, the sound was great. It was very much this, it's now, it's happening now, it's of the moment, and you walk out what was the hallway of the theater out to Danforth Street, and it's just this disconnect. It was almost like you jumped through the future and now walked back out into the past. Unfortunately, this was the one and only time I got to see the Jam, but cut the unfortunately. This was amazing. I got to see them once. I'm lucky. And also that I got to see them touring what I believe to be their best album. So very, very special, and feel grateful I got to have that experience. Now, in terms of the Jam themselves, as I said, I remained a mega fan right until the end of their career, and have loved them ever since. I've always loved them. They followed up all mod cons with their acclaimed Setting Suns later in 1979, and then Sound Effects in 1980, which is my second most favorite Jam LP. And that was also their first top 40 album here in Canada. They wrapped things up in the spring of 1982 with their final album, The Gift. And in my mind, that album I always pair it with Combat Rock by The Clash because both of those albums came out just weeks apart from each other. And then following its release and another tour, and some of my favorite singles came out later that year from the band. Weller announced at the end of the year he was leaving the band. They were breaking up, and that was it. That was it, the end of an era. But he got to go out on his own terms. Also, their final album gifted them with their first UK #1. Although they, think about it, they'd had 16 top 20 UK hits, 4 of which went to #1. So a phenomenal career. Now, Weller, of course, went on to form the Style Council, which sort of picked up on a lot of the R&B sounds and themes of the later Jam with Mick Talbot. And for me, with the Style Council, they started off great. I love that first Style Council album. I just recently replayed it, and it was just great. Sounded as good as I'd remembered. And then the second album, Our Favorite Shop in Britain and Internationalists Here, that's also good. After that, things went kind of pear-shaped for Paul Weller, and by the early 90s, he was in a major career slump and then completely reestablished himself in the UK as a solo performer and reached a whole new audience and a whole new level of success. And particularly some of those albums from the 90s, Wildwood, which has that very Traffic feel to it, and Stanley Road, not Stanley Street. I'm thinking of Stanley Street here in London. Stanley Road. These are fantastic albums. And Weller is still knocking them dead today. Still working, making great music, playing. He's a legend in the UK and in the hearts to many of us around the world. He sort of ended up as the granddad of Britpop in the 90s. Weller actually recently hit a charts milestone over in the UK. And this is from an article that appeared in The Guardian Friday, July 10th, 2020, by Ben Beaumont Thomas. And Paul Weller joins Lennon and McCartney with #1 albums in 5 straight decades. He had just released his new album in the spring, and it hit #1 in the UK, and it gave him this distinction in UK chart history. To read from the article, Paul Weller has joined John Lennon and Paul McCartney as the only artists to top the UK album chart in 5 consecutive decades. Weller said he was very proud to see his album On Sunset reach #1. His previous chart toppers include one with the Jam, The Gift, which we were talking about earlier, from 1982, and one with the Style Council, Our Favorite Shop, 1985, plus 5 solo albums. On Sunset plus Stanley Road, yeah, we're back to that again. I got it right this time. In 1995, that's one of my favorite Weller solo albums. Illumination in 2002, 22 Dreams in 2008, and Sonic Kicks in 2012. Well done, Paul. Still a thriving and creative career. And a lot of his recent solo albums have been very experimental, so he's an artist that just keeps moving forward. Now, as for Bruce Foxton and Rick Buckler, the rhythm section of the Jam, Bruce Foxton went on to have a solo career for a while, but they eventually came back together for a while as From the Jam, focusing on a lot of the numbers that Bruce Foxton sang lead on and some of the other tracks, and toured for a while with Weller's blessing. Well, that's all for this episode 12 on the wonderful, memorable set that I saw from the late, great Jam. Up next is episode 13, concert number 5, and my last live show of the 1970s, in an even smaller and more intimate place than the Jam gig, taking place at the still-standing Polish Hall here in London, Ontario, on Ann Street. I actually go past it on my walks and runs several times a week. It literally looks almost unchanged from the 70s, and featuring a trio of the city's then most prominent punk bands. I'm looking forward to sharing this one with you, dear listeners, as 1979 was also the year that I started seeing local live music in bars, something that would become akin to breathing for me in the 80s and early 90s. So this is kind of where it all started, and I'm keen to discuss how important our local scene, but also local scenes in general, how important they were, how important mine was, and how they still are. Now, this was a ticketed show in a proper performance hall, so I'm including it as part of the series, even though I had seen some of these bands before at both the Cedar Lounge, which had become really the home of punk rock here in London for many years, and the legendary York Tavern, also 2 blocks over, which has, of course, been called the Office here in London since the early 80s. Please come back for, again, episode 13, What's in the City? NFG's second annual Halloween Bash, also with the Regulators and the Sinners at the Polish Hall, London, Ontario, Canada, Friday, November 2nd, 1979. Stay tuned for underage drinking, musical lifelines, and escaping before the police turned up. And that wasn't the only time that happened. Thanks so much for listening. Remember that along with the blog and the podcast, we also have the My Life in Concert YouTube channel, the Spotify playlists. Again, they all start with MLIC and a prompt under various artists as the person putting the list together. Anyway, that's my Spotify name, same as my pen name. And we're also on Facebook and Instagram, so please like, follow, and comment, especially if you were at any of these gigs, any memories you might have. I'm your host, Various Artists, signing off from another MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. Let's meet up at the next show. Bye for now.